The Vietnam War was a war that lasted for 3 long decades and ended with failure and uneasy peace. When what happened, the Vietnam War gave rise to many controversial events and horrifying drama, resulting in a grim outcome. Now you might be thinking, wait, we're the U.S. We never win a war. Well, we never lose a war. Well, you're half right. Due to extensive research on websites and some documentary watchings, as well as some school lectures, I can explain how the and I can explain everything you need to know about the war. The war began with the Geneva Accords, battles, and a coup and a fall from grace that would have a huge impact on history as we know it. Let's start with the Geneva Conventions. According to the History Channel, in July 1954, the Geneva Accords were held in Geneva. Just recently, Vietnam had recently got done fighting a war with the French, who had long time been colonizers of the region, and now they were free. However, there was a problem. There was a communist faction led by leader Ho Chi Minh, but it was secretly funded by the Soviet Union. But the U.S. and free countries wanted Vietnam to also be a free democratic country. In order to keep this good, they decided to split the country in half. They split Vietnam in half at the 17th parallel, with Ho Chi Minh and his communist forces in the north, and a southern democratic state ruled by an installed puppet ruler named Ngo Dinh Diem. However, and for a time, it was meant to be temporary, with elections to be held that would ultimately determine the leader of a fully united Vietnam. However, these elections would never end up happening. Shortly after that, however, a guerrilla group of southern peasants, secretly being funded by the North, began making small attacks on several southern villages, military bases, and other high locations, known as the Viet Cong. They were using a spy trail that had been formed themselves, which came to be known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This started rising tensions, and some small battles were already breaking out. But what really set it off was an event in August of 1964. A ship, a U.S. Army vessel, U.S. Navy vessel, the USS Maddox, was patrolling Vietnamese territory in the Gulf of Tonkin when North Vietnamese patrol boats saw it and opened fire on it. The event gave Congress back home the excuse they needed, and President Lyndon B. Johnson gave the go-ahead to start sending troops down to Vietnam. And then this is what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Now that we talked about that, and about the beginning and the rise up to us getting into the war, let's talk about the war's duration. You see, back home, back in Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem was proving to be a bit more than the U.S. can handle. He was rather corrupt, and a Catholic nationalist. He had a deep discrimination. He was highly discriminative against Buddhists, which unfortunately happened to be almost the entire population of Vietnam. This earned him very little support and made him very unpopular with the people. Despite that, he introduced a very brutal autocratic regime. And it became so bad that eventually the U.S. secretly funded a coup that ended up having both him and his brother killed by rioters. Now that with him, this would probably prove to be a huge mistake. With Ngo gone, South Vietnam would forever spend the rest of the war as run by a weak military junta filled with corrupt and proud officials. In November 1965, what is considered the first major battle of the Vietnam War occurred at La Drang Valley. This resulted in over 300 U.S. soldiers killed. Further to that, in April of 1967, the first anti-war protests would begin. These protests would haunt the rest of the duration of the Vietnam War. So, as a result, eventually the U.S. began doing systematic bombings of the Ho Chi Minh Trail sections. Despite, however, no matter how many times they bombed it, volunteers were quick to rebuild new areas, new branches, new trails, new sections. And also, part of the trail ran into the nearby next door countries of Cambodia and Laos. Rather difficult. The tensions was already building, support for the war was losing, and the soldiers were starting to lose sight of what they were fighting for. Finally, in January of 1968, on the Vietnamese lunar holiday of Tet, the North Vietnamese, both Viet Cong and some normal North Vietnamese army soldiers, launched simultaneous attacks on several military installations in major cities all throughout South Vietnam, and caught the South Vietnamese and the U.S. soldiers by surprise. They managed to fight, but slowly they were quickly able to mobilize and fought back against the attackers. And the operation turned out to be a huge military failure on the part of the North Vietnamese, with almost the entirety of the Viet Cong being wiped out. But however, this event was a turning point in the war. There's famous footage of a Viet Cong soldier being shot by a South Vietnamese police officer. When shown back home, this caused anti-war tensions strain, and up to that point, we actually thought we were finally winning. It had been quite silent up till then, but now the tension and the anger and the resentment was back, and it would also begin the long and sad process of the U.S. pullout from South Vietnam. So now that we've gone to the duration of the war, let's begin with the end. Things kind of went downhill after what became known as the Tet Offensive. In March of 1968, a group of U.S. soldiers were out scouting for Viet Cong members. For members of the Viet Cong when they came upon the village of My Lai. Of course, soldiers at this point you couldn't really distinguish a Viet Cong fighter from a normal villager. So instead, they began staging a mass massacre of the village, wiping almost 800 villagers, including women and children. This caused such a setback in the media. It caused a huge setback in the media, and support for the war dropped even more, with people even questioning the morale of the soldiers fighting in the war. Between 1969 and 1972, the Nixon administration began a process known as Vietnamization, which was the casual withdrawal of American forces out of Vietnam. He also began a Cambodian bombing operation that would target sections of the Ho Chi Minh Trail. However, in order to avoid a huge media, complaint, they decided to cover it up. However, it eventually did get leaked, and, of course, pissed off, he decided to begin wiretapping some places, which led to the infamous Watergate scandal and to Nixon's eventual step down from office. Finally, in January of 1975, Nixon's successor, Gerald Ford, recalls all U.S. troops from South Vietnam, leaving the South Vietnamese at the mercy of the communists. They were fighting a civil war that they knew they couldn't win. Eventually, it became too gradual enough that the North Vietnamese troops eventually managed to converge on the southern capital of Saigon to take it over, fully reunifying Vietnam under a communist dictatorship. Saigon would be renamed Ho Chi Minh City. To conclude, the Vietnam War began with the Geneva Accords, marked by many tough battles, a coup, and a fall from grace that had a huge impact on history as we know it. And for the veterans, the war meant so much more than fighting for America. It was fighting to stop the spread of communism that ended with them abandoning the locals and people that they were sent to protect.